ultimately we are the thing that will create that future. All of us. We are the creative, generative forces of the future that could be here today. And for that, the Institute and many other organizations around the world are stepping up to reconnect us to indigenous wisdom. And natural law was the original wisdoms coming out of our indigenous cultures.
Well, welcome back to another episode of the Mark Groves podcast. This is a 3-time returning guest. You're like Michael Jordan coming back, but getting better and better as opposed to Michael Jordan not getting better and better in his time. So welcome back, Dr. Zach Bush.
Sounds good. Glad to be here. If ratings start to drop, I'll threaten to retire or something like that.
Perfect. Just create some drama and it'll all be good. A lot in the world has happened since the last time we spoke. There's certainly the conversation, as we spoke about before we hit record, is moving away from the sort of how do we make sense of COVID and viruses and all that kind of stuff. And you did a really beautiful job of allowing us to look that nature is trying to be in harmony with us. And I think with the way that humanity has been, especially what capitalism does and just this constant extraction, is that extraction in and of itself without restoration is actually in conflict with the way nature works. So maybe we can start there and what that starts for you and how the body naturally does seek this through the microbiome and things like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think we're at this exciting pivot point right now as we come out of a couple of years of lockdown and extraordinary erosions of civil liberties and all of this that you and I have talked about some. But this moment that we're in now is giving us an opportunity at the individual level as well as the familial level, community level, societal levels to become a little more proactive in the future that we want to manifest. I think to date, we've been on this slippery slope of unawareness of the future we're creating through our global behaviors of consumerism. And that consumerism has largely been pushing us towards laziness on a lot of levels, complacency. And for that, we've outsourced almost everything that has to do with a productive life. We've outsourced our food, which we used to grow in our gardens. We've outsourced our education to federal governments. We've outsourced our socioeconomics to central banks that are beyond nation states. They are not ruled by elected leaders anywhere in the world, but these are private organizations. And so we now have fiscal policy, financial policies that are creating unstable relationships between fiat currencies globally. We see incredible, outsourcing, I think, of our concept of creativity. Creativity got co-opted initially in Google when we started to allow advertising dollars to usurp the data that was coming out of human curiosity. The old phrase of, "Oh, I need to Google it," that became a verb, because as soon as we were curious, we went to the search engine. And the search engine was commoditizing our curiosity. And so we got into this situation where we outsourced curiosity and the excitement of discovery to this instantaneous gratification to a private organization with an algorithm that was controlled by artificial intelligence that would ultimately be programmed to maximize advertising dollars rather than human ingenuity. And so when curiosity got co-opted for advertising and sales instead of the process of ingenuity and discovery, we ceased to progress, I think, at that point as a society in a positive direction. And of course, that's not a blanket statement. There's sparks in the barrel. There's people that exited out of that and have been innovating in different spaces. But as a society, I think you can see a sudden glass ceiling set for us where what we were thinking was being dictated by our search engines and by our social media feeds and everything else. And so we've literally outsourced everything and therefore became vulnerable to a global narrative of fear that became known as the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's the stage that we're now recovering from or in the midst of the chaos of. And I've seen it happen in my own life in spades. I've seen it happen in the lives of my children as they're heading into their 20s. And enjoying kind of adulthood and also looking out into a daunting world of crisis, climate change and world wars and threats of nuclear war again, and all of the cycles of fear that are out there for them, and watching them make life decisions for themselves. And I'm watching it in my friends, families, colleagues, and society at large, is that we are starting to do massive resets, almost down to the last person we're being asked to leave behind long-held beliefs, constructs, relationships, and start to be willing to consider a completely different framework for our own set of values of self, the values that we put into our work. So you see people leaving their jobs, starting the companies they've always meant to start, leaving relationships, starting relationships. The whole thing is just in this tumultuous, churning state of transformation right now, which is very exciting. I think from a concept of human potential, but also just energetics. We got 7.8 billion people. Imagine harnessing the curiosity, creativity, and productive capacity of 7.8 billion people. Like it's beyond comprehension what we could all do together if we developed a cohesive vibration of a future that we want to bring into reality. And it would happen so instantaneously. It would happen overnight if we were to focus for a positive outcome on a future that was integrated into nature. Just as we saw in an instant, the old paradigm froze for a moment. Everybody locked down, went to their homes, stopped going to work. I mean, things that seemed absolutely impossible 2.5 years ago became reality instantaneously with enough fear. And so the question at this point that I think we stand in is, can we do an opposite vibration to fear to create the same unified outcome of a whole species motivated towards one goal, which then was survival, but fear was the driving element. And so we did survival in the belief of scarcity of everything and a fear of death. If we flip that vibration around and we move cohesively as a society, the vibration of love and a pursuit of beauty, rather than fear and death, and we start to move into a state of abundance rather than scarcity, imagine what we could create. The challenge, of course, is that the words beauty, love, and abundance, seemingly extremely attractive in their patina, lack the motivational aspects that fear, shame, and guilt have been used for as driving forces within our species. So there's this opportunity now to look into nature as we see her going extinct under the pressure of our consumerism, our extractive, destructive nature that comes out of our belief of scarcity. And we can look into that nature as it dies, and we can learn a lot about previous extinction events and what's afoot right now in this current extinction event. And it really speaks down to this microscopic level that you and I have talked about on podcasts in the past, which is how microbes create society. How does the microbiome function to create life on Earth? Because it all sprang out of the soil. All of life, all of the diversity sprang out of soil. How did it happen? How did we get the diversity of plants, animals, and the rest? And so that's, I think, this tipping point. As we kill her, can we learn enough from her under her stress to completely change our way of being?
When we're reorienting towards joy, abundance, possibility, love, I wonder, is that a similar process to rescuing the body from dis-ease, inflammation? I think it's sort of like, what is it, as above, so below? It feels similar in that context, because how we move as a society, especially because there's been so much weaponization of fear, shame, and belonging. I've said recently that the weaponization of connection and the threat of not getting connection if you don't do these behaviors or comply or have a certain belief, I can only imagine the impact that has on the body. I guess, is it essentially as above, so below?
It really is. I think once we find these fundamental truths of biology is a tempting place to go, but to go deeper below the biology, you end up in physics. And interestingly, if you go below physics, you end up in philosophy. So philosophy was the very first science and is considered really the only pure science on the planet. Physics came out of philosophy during the Greek era, where we started to interpret, the elements of the earth in relationship to our philosophy of who are we, why are we here, and where are we going. And so the oldest science on the planet, considered still the only pure science, is philosophy. and physics, and then biology, and all these other areas have cropped out of that, course of human discovery and human curiosity ultimately. And so as we bore down on it and we find these fundamental truths, they hold true at every fractal, every micro to macro level of reality that we live in. And when we look at those fundamental truths that have guided 4 billion years of productive advancement of intelligence on this planet and biologic diversity, we can find that the fundamental truth is that a sharing economy of new possibility is the beginning of everything. And the way in which that's done in physics and biology is through the exchange of information. At the physics level, that's done through the exchange of energy. And energy is transferred through electrons and protons. They interact then to start to create the phenomenon of molecules or elements within the periodic chart, and then subsequently molecules that are a relationship of those elements. And then ultimately they can create the complexity of a single cell, a bacterium. And once the bacterium is created, you can start to see this higher and higher levels of communication occurring across these different levels, and more expression of diversity is the natural outflow. So diversity seems to be the goal. The more biodiversity created seems to be one of the primary functions of biology. And it seems to what end is the answer, and to what end are we creating biodiversity? The answer seems to be adaptation. With more biodiversity, you get more adaptable systems that can survive bigger and bigger insults and bigger stressors. And so right now, we're in the 6th great extinction, and with each of those extinction events, there's been an existential threat that came and severely disrupted the biologic systems that have been developing for billions of years previous. And in each of those cases, we see more adaptation occur during the stress. And that's the expression of viruses that we talked about on the last podcast. So viruses are a genomic communication method for expressing new opportunities or new possibilities of life to occur that would escape the current existential threats of extinction. And so when we put organisms under stress, it's their first instinct to let's create more diverse organisms out there by sharing our genome as quickly as possible in as many variants as possible. So the cell starts to misspell genes and starts to put out all these new genetic sequences to see if they can find a gain of function. And when you have trillions of genes getting expressed by trillions of organisms, it doesn't take long to find those gain of function genes that can be swapped from species to species to create this new adaptation or biodiversity within the system of life. And so that's what we see as a fundamental truth. Biodiversity leads to adaptation, leads to the possibility of new beauty. And that's true at that microscopic level of genetics or the virome. It's true at the level of bacterium and the way in which they've diversified across the planet with horizontal gene transfer, where they can pass genes from cell to cell by bumping into each other and exchanging genetic information. And so there's just this constant opportunistic push that nature does at this single cell level and below that allows adaptation and biodiversity to happen very quickly. If you look at humans, we've gotten away from that. And maybe one time we were in that mode back in the barter system of society and all of this. But today we have adapted into this severe state of proprietary beliefs that we own things, right? And so if you go out there in the entrepreneurial world, it's not unusual. But for you to even sit down at this table, you have to sign this non-disclosure agreement. I think I have something that's going to save the world, but I'm not going to tell you what's going to save the world until you agree that I own that thing and I control the money that would come out of that thing. So that's been our general behavior in innovation and technology and all of that. It's also our attitude towards the planet itself. When we started to move out of our indigenous wisdom that we were stewards of the earth and started moving into the colonial mind that we were owners of the earth, that broke this relationship of sharing and adaptation and biodiversity on the planetary level, and we started to create fences and walls and identities within communities that were us and them, and all the separation philosophy that led to these separate nations and these separate extractive economies that were competing against one another and the rest. So there's something fundamentally unnatural about human behavior that we've been engaged in for thousands of years under this colonial mindset and under this state of scarcity that we drive. And there's an opportunity for us to reimagine this quickly. And I think the pandemic really revealed this relationship of a story of a virus that was going to kill humanity and the behavior of governments against its people during those times. And so we saw the fastest erosion of civil liberties in history, at least our recent history in these democratic countries of Canada, where you're at, United States, certainly New Zealand, probably, and Australia seeing some of the worst of it globally, but almost every nation, China being a horrific example of it as well. Every nation locking down civil liberties to such a severe degree that we really saw these police states emerge. In Canada, we saw bank accounts frozen of truck drivers that were protesting the government's treatment of supply chains and the undervaluation of those supply chains. And we saw in New Zealand people's property being seized because they were refusing to be vaccinated and things like this. So it was an extraordinary demonstration of an equal and opposite reaction, right? And so we demonize nature. We say, oh, adaptation and viruses are really bad, so we need to fear viruses. We need to fear, gain of function, whatever it is. And we also need to fear change at the human societal level. And so we're going to lock everything down. We're going to prevent change from happening, which is basically what you're saying when you say, oh, go into social isolation, be afraid of everybody around you because they might give you a germ. That isolationism was practiced at all these different levels, at the single human level for their protection of immune system and at the societal level for the protection of the citizen, and so it's very bizarre how our reactionary behaviors of monotony and isolation occurred across all these different levels simultaneously.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor, which I want to give you a disclaimer about. This is a paid advertisement, and when you make a purchase of this product, I do receive a small commission. And this commission helps us to produce this podcast, to get it in your ears, to distribute it, and all the wonderful things. Now, you might be wondering, what is the product? Well, I'm so happy you asked. The product is ION, which stands for Intelligence of Nature, and it is a suite of soil-derived microbiome supporting products that seek to help restore connection, the connection from cell to cell, and in turn, person to planet. It does this because it is sourced from 60 million year old soil. Like, that is some old soil. And ION is more than just a supplement, it is a support system. So the way that I use it is I take ION 3 times a day, usually before meals, and I take it with the intention to improve my gut health. Now, I have to say it has led to me feeling like I have improved digestion and then all the things that come along with that, reduced bloating, gas, and all that. But I'm really excited to see the impact it has on my stool tests as well. If this sounds like something that you're interested in trying, then visit the link in the show notes and use the code CREATETHELOVE to save 15% off. And this 15% off coupon applies to all one-time purchases. It does exclude bundles and subscription purchases, and the offer is only available to U.S. residents.
It seems to also bring up like the obsession with sterilization, the obsession with like our inability to even have diverse thought now. Like, if you don't believe this, you're anti that. Like, there's even political parties you see, they just get further and further away from each other and their definitions get narrower and narrower and no one really fits into them. Like, it seems to me that the problem isn't necessarily the glaring quote unquote division, but rather the absence of, as I called it nuance, but it's really diversity. And what you're saying is like, we're supposed to have one crop, one way of acting, one way of believing, one way of seeing. And if you don't do that, then you're against progress, which really progress is the solution to progress. If I hear you correctly, is actually the diversity of those things. And that's true of human systems. Like, good functioning families have diverse thought and have diverse perspective. And functioning romantic relationships, functioning democracies actually hold diversity and dissent because through it, we break through, as you're saying, the pressure breaks through to like another leap. And if we're restricting the pressure that's created by diversity, then we don't have ingenuity. And you're saying that's on all levels, which makes so much sense. Like the way that you articulate it, like I'm just seeing all these puzzle pieces, like fall into place of like, oh wow, it's all the same behavior. It's all the same behavior that is what cultivated out of fear. Like when I'm sold the idea of monocrops, which, I grew up with like an uncle and aunt who are farmers and they had one crop, and I look at it and I'm like, well, now you look at food and you look at how food affects us. Like our bodies are not healthier. Our societies are not healthier. We're sold this idea that through doing all these things, we'll live longer, we'll live forever, but it seems to be that the opposite is happening. It's the answer, Dr. Zach. Get us out.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think, the harder we grab onto, the concept of survival instead of being alive, we die quickly. And so we need to survive this pandemic, became kind of the battle call. But in the effort to survive, we all stopped living. We stopped having community. We stopped, touching our own loved ones that were dying in hospitals. We stopped the humanity of humanism. We stopped. And so we became some sort of strange version of ourselves at the societal level. Fortunately, there was the opposite reaction to it, though. At the individual levels, we saw so many amazing people stepping up to do incredible things during the pandemic. We saw new nonprofits and new NGOs, and we saw new, science narratives coming up and new online platforms being created in real time to create, free voice and ability to exchange information. And so that was the reaction. But I think your statement around monoculture isn't really important, because we were talking about nature pushing for biodiversity at every level. And to realize that humans are doing monoculture at every level is pretty extraordinary. At the cellular level, gut health is kind of a funny example of it. As we run around saying you need to plant these 3 or 4 species of bacteria in your gut for health. So we started 30 years ago a probiotic industry that's now $47 billion a year of probiotics sold globally. $47 billion of monoculture happening in the intestines of humans around the world. We had severe concerns about that approach in medicine. Everybody who's in the gut health microbiome stuff had severe concerns about that approach for years. And finally, the studies got done and published. Studies started in 2014, got published in 2018, showing that the monoculture of 3 species of bacteria in high numbers of through a probiotic was having the same suppression effect as antibiotics were on the gut microbiome. And so here we are running around saying, here's the antidote to antibiotics, and it's a monoculture approach, and therefore it turns out to be just as harmful. At the same time, in the 1970s, that we were running around saying, here's your probiotics, and you should drink this, eat this, whatever, we were running around telling people, here's the 3 crops you can grow. You can pick soybeans, corn, and wheat. And so go do those 3 things. In some climates, it was sugarcane, canola, and, name your third one. It could be sugar beets or whatever it is. And the interesting thing is, none of those 3 things tend to end up in large volumes on a human plate, and for the most part, they're ending up as some sort of processed chemical, ethanol for gasoline, plastics for the apparel industry, processed chemicals like high fructose corn syrup for our packaged and processed consumer goods. All of this. And so you say, here's the 3 crops that you need to go grow so that you can feed the world, because there's world hunger and it must be due to a shortage of crops. You can grow more crops if you just grow corn for 10,000 acres than if you're trying to grow 7 species. You're so inefficient. If you would grow 1, you'd be so efficient. You could just sow 1 seed for thousands of acres. You could use 1 machine to harvest all of that. You could use 1 supply chain to go store that in 1 grain elevator up the road. It's all very efficient if you just go to monoculture, and we need to feed the world. And so farmers were told that in the Midwest. They were like, the world is starving. It's up to you to save the day here. It was this slippery slope of this promise of this altruism of feed the world that allowed them to continue their path. And I think at the same time, we did that to doctors. We gave them this altruistic belief: if the world is dying, you need to go save the world. And so here's your altruistic mission. Here's the antibiotics that will cure all diseases. Here's the vaccines that will prevent all diseases. Here's the 3 things you're allowed to do for depression, or here's the 3 things you're allowed to do for cancer, radiation, surgery, or chemotherapy. And so we've created these monoculture type behaviors, toolkits, prescriptions across all of these levels. And, it would be one thing if we just allowed it to stop there, but then the fact that we do that in our day-to-day social interactions, and in the face of a pandemic of isolation, you would think that at that moment we would have reacted and said, good Lord, we just all need to be connected. Let's just talk. Let's all connect. Let's all compare notes. Let's all start talking about the future that we all want to see. And instead, we created a new phenomenon that has now been called cancel culture. And so we did that in the middle of a pandemic. We decided, well, if somebody has a differing viewpoint on social media, I'm going to cancel them out of my life. I'm going to demonize them, just as it's just astounding that this monotony is embraced at every level of humanity. We are so afraid of hearing an opposite, viewpoint, or an opposite perspective. We get hives to it. We're so reactive to something slightly outside of our own perspective, which is probably a pretty deep sign of insecurity, right? Like, we must be pretty fearful of we must have a deep sense of the instability of the reality that we're trying to maintain if we're so adverse to a slight difference of opinion.
That's beautiful, because you think about that is the sterilization of everything that isn't us. Also the arrogance of humanity to think, one, that we don't need diverse crop, we don't need diverse soil. I think it's just so fascinating in a sad way, I guess, that when we look, we sort of trust our politics, we trust our agriculture, we trust pharma. Well, I don't, but people tend to, as a sort of a culture. And I used to. And I even used to, on some level, trust public health to at least guide certain decisions. And I think this has happened. I think it's backfired on them, because through COVID, all of the corruption that normally was sort of implicit in the systems, and the extrapolation and the extraction that was happening on not so much an overt level, it just started to become more glaringly obvious. And, this inability to hold diverse thought, it shows that, as you said, we must be so afraid of the actual identity we hold because it doesn't stand on solid truth. Like, if it stood on solid truth, then, I think it's pretty widely understood that, like, truth doesn't care about debate, because the truth will always survive debate. But when we actually get down to, like, the conversation about what was the appropriate response to COVID, what is the appropriate, were lockdowns okay? Is this one vaccine the answer to everything? Is monoculture and monocrops, are these actually the way to feed the world? Is biodiversity good? Is the microbiome, do we need more diverse than just these, probiotics that you mentioned? Those debates are not happening, because if there was a debate, the current way of being would not survive. I think that's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, I think for the current system to survive for a moment longer, we're going to have more and more severe control of differing thought, because it's so fragile now. The U.S. dollar, so fragile right now. We printed $4 trillion in less than 18 months in the United States. That has sent us into a long spiral of inflation that it's going to take us years and years to dig out of. And so when you put the primary reserve currency of the world into an inflationary state, you create inherent instability. And then you couple that with the massive debt that the United States is carrying now. We're getting to this extremely fragile state of solubility as a macroeconomic structure. And the world is adapting to that. The world, you can see steps being taken. The Brexit was a big piece of this. When you see London stepping out of, a relationship to the EU and starting to develop, more of a sovereign isolationist, identity to their currency and their economic policy, that's a stance that's suggesting they're standing up to replace the United States, on some level in this economic maelstrom of an unstable global reserve currency that's typically been the US dollar. So whether it's the sterling and pound there in the UK, or new structures of the SDR, which is it wasn't meant to be a currency, but is starting to be structured as a currency there at the central banks. So you have these different organizations that are stepping up to take proactive measures to try to stabilize an international currency system that is going to likely shift away from the US dollar, faster and faster in these coming years. When you see that level of instability globally around something as foundational, if you will, as a reserve currency, the control of information has to be severe to keep people from panicking, right? And so there's going to be this effort to squash any voice that says there's a problem at all, because the problem is so big. And so we could say the same thing about human health. The crisis of human health is so severe right now that governments and health agencies and all pharmaceutical industries don't want you to know just how vulnerable human health is, because there would be a mad rush for the door out of Western medicine and out of healthcare in general if people knew the scale of what was going on the chronic disease side, or more frightening perhaps the infertility side of humanity, as the sixth extinction kind of looms. And so that control of information is perhaps in some ways not even malignant. It's just a sense of desperation to try to stabilize for a little bit longer a system that is going to be increasingly in collapse and already is in collapse. And so the longer they can kick the can down the road of kind of a global awareness of this collapsing system, the less likely they get the rush to the door, And so I think there's a tendency in lawmakers, regulators, central bankers, doctors, healthcare systems at large to be like, look, I know we're going in the wrong direction. I know things are at crisis, but we can't really tell the whole truth, or else people are going to panic, and then we're going to have hospitals overflowing, and then we're going to have massive recessions, and then we're going to have massive instability in global marketplace, and we'll have a stock market crash. And so everybody has all of the fear of the reality that they've created is going to unfold, and they're trying to kick that out as long as possible. So I think if all of us just kind of start to acknowledge that, of like, okay, the effort towards monoculture, the effort towards locking down alternative voices or perspectives on the status quo of any sector, it's not because there's a cabal trying to kill us. It's because we created a reality that's inherently unstable. And now we're having to face the Pied Piper here, and we're having to come to terms with the fact that, wow, we created something horrifically misaligned with nature. And the things we're bantering and pounding our chest about is, how dare you freeze my bank accounts? Well, it's because we created and bought into a system that was so inherently unstable that it would require something as severe as locking down any perspective, or make sure nobody's don't stop driving the trucks, for God's sake. That's the last pin in this fragile economy of Canada or the US or Western civilization at large. And so we created the phenomenon that those that are trying to control us are fearful of the collapse, and they're trying to do things to temporize our awareness of the collapse, I believe. And so can we really be angry at them? No, we were complicit in creating the whole system that they're trying to do the house of cards, juggling of. I don't feel any malignancy towards governments right now. That these lawmakers are up a creek without a paddle. Like, nobody's offering them real solutions. And so I think they're being offered lots of money to temporize the current strong narrative. And that's the only option they've got. Nobody else is saying, well, there's this other alternative that you could do as a legislator. That's the void that I hope that we can all step into together. And so one of the invitations that I would have in this conversation is a new dialogue that we're framing in the context of a new nonprofit called Institute of Natural Law and Governance. And in this mission, we're looking at the opportunity to take everything we've learned under the microscope with the communication network between bacteria and fungi and how they coordinate biodiversity and adaptation. How can we learn from that and adapt social political systems that base themselves on that freedom of communication and that freedom of information towards the purpose of biodiversity? What does social and political leadership look like when biodiversity is the outcome rather than monoculture the outcome. One of the front ends of this, 4 avenues of impact: awareness, education, innovation, policy. That's what we deployed with Farmers Footprint and Project Biome, our big 501c3 effort to kind of regenerate the planet through food systems. We need a regenerative socioeconomic structure now. We need a regenerative concept of governance. And through those 4 channels of awareness, education, innovation, and policy, we see a very clear path forward for all of us to participate. And so just as we were bringing awareness at the beginning to the regenerative agriculture movement, and then we started into education, and now we're working on policy and some other things, we're going to start back at that with Institute of Natural Law at the beginning of awareness. And we're going to start to reintroduce the world to the body of science that's been around for thousands of years that is referred to as natural law. This was the fundamental foundation of Confucianism in China, as the fundamental foundation of the First Nations that were present in North America at the time of colonialism. When Europe arrived in North America, there was over 600 nations living in sovereign relationship to each other throughout North America, Mexico, US, and Canada. 600 and some nations that were living in cooperative relationship to one another for tens of thousands of years. And they had created an agricultural system that was feeding all of them without supply chains leaving North America. And so estimates right now is that there was around 100 million people, at least in North America at the time of this colonial arrival. And so right now we have 330 million. So it was a big population, a third of current, 400 years ago. And they were feeding themselves autonomously, and they were governing themselves under natural law. And so they had polyculture agriculture, and they had polyculture at the socio-political levels. Unfortunately, natural law over the last couple hundred years has lost its underpinnings of nature. And so if you go to Wikipedia right now and read natural law, it might tell you about Confucianism, might tell you about the Iroquois, might tell you about some examples of natural law in indigenous leadership around the world right now, but it never mentions nature. It's all in the human context. And so one of our missions at the Institute of Natural Law and Governance is to expand our concept of natural law to include the rights of nature and the behavior of nature, ultimately, to learn from nature as a template for human society, to understand how when you build a system of communication and resource management or resource sharing within a society, it has to consider the whole as its primary outcome. And in considering the whole, its interests are in always accelerating the biodiversification of the system, and for all the biodiversity, creating more and more capacity for adaptation. And so welcoming more and more opportunity for change rather than resisting change. And so that's going to be an exciting few years ahead as we take what we've learned from regenerative agriculture and start to apply it to regenerative governance. And I think we're going to discover in that, among many things, a new form of leadership that starts to look like stewardship. And a new form of stewardship will apply to all areas of science. And so if you go to the website, which is naturallawandgov.org, the website starts to break it down into all these different applied sciences. And so the applied sciences that we'll be looking to innovate in will take on user groups. And so we'll have user groups internationally who will tackle engineering or materials or energy commodities and tackle these different areas of technology or science and start to apply natural law and concepts of sovereignty of nature within these areas of science, and start to reimagine that future for the built world, for human capital, for human sovereignty. What does it start to look like when we start creating a food system that is not built on slave labor, which is what it's been built on for tens of thousands of years? And so how do we start to imagine this natural law system in everything from food to education to information technologies to engineering and beyond? So I'm very excited about this next chapter. We'll be launching the Institute formally with some sharing and webinars that we'll be giving. I'll be coming to that in November from Egypt. Egypt sits at the northern end of the Golden Meridian from which all life emerged. And so we're going back to this origin state of the planet from Giza the Great Pyramids there down to South Africa, you see this meridian, this longitudinal line from which all biodiversity sprung out of. Far before first humans sprung from that region of the earth, we saw the diversity of plants, the diversity of animals springing out of that space. And that remains the case today. Just down in South Africa alone, we can find 2/3 of the genetics of the biodiversity of the planet sitting there right in South Africa in a single country. So this is a verdant place to reimagine humanity as a society, as perhaps a humane system of coherence with our nature. And so we'll be launching that in November, but we'll look for global traction as governments and citizens alike start to relinquish the fear, greed, guilt paradigms, start moving into this concept of abundance, of like, wow, if we really create regenerative economics where rights of nature are fundamental at the core of these economic structures, there's so much to be had. Energy is infinite. Energy is not limited to oil reserves. Energy is infinite. We have so many ways to create, infinite and free energy for the planet. And by creating those systems, we can create completely new economic systems that aren't built on the scarcity of energy and are instead embracing the abundance of energy on the planet. And for that, we can create different socioeconomic structures and educational systems around it. So I couldn't be more excited in the end about the vulnerability of the situation we're in, because it's demanding massive systems change.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And that sounds like a really incredible movement, institute. And I'm curious, does that require, I have two questions, but I'll just start with one because I know how it goes. We'll ask one and then we'll end up down a rabbit hole. So let's end up down a rabbit hole. Does this require the dissolution or removal or loving removal of those, or is it a mindset and individuals that have an accumulation mindset, like this idea that there's never enough? Like, it sounds to me like to be in natural law, you can't be in that state of constant extraction and accumulation. And in order for that to happen, it's sort of like society might feel that way. You listening to the podcast might feel that way. And yet the people moving the chess pieces at the massive corporate level, we're talking about saying goodbye to immense amounts of wealth and accumulation and privilege and all the things. Maybe that's a big question, but what does that look like if we have to say goodbye to a system that in a lot of ways people love? The top 0.1% really they're kicking ass right now. They're like, we don't need this idea. Dr. Zach Bush's institute, we don't want that. That's a horrible idea. We don't like natural law. We wrote the Wikipedia page. Hell no.
Yeah, and I think that's, those attitudes will certainly be out there. I think that there's a very large, not just the people that are moving the billions of dollars or moving government regulatory, but there's consumers that are afraid of change. I think we all are inherently afraid of change, but it's happened before. And unfortunately, with the last iterations of change, we did see massive disappearance of corporations and rebirths of economic, drivers. Of the Fortune 100 companies that existed at the beginning of the concept of Fortune 100, when that first got published, I think that must have been the 1960s. But of the Fortune 100 companies that first got published, there's only one left on the Fortune 500, and so all other 99 are gone. And so that one company is at the very bottom of the list now, which is GE. And so General Electric is the last company standing. And the only reason it's standing is because it's actually tens of thousands of companies. It did a good job of diversifying its portfolio and it became an innovation hub, and it became basically a business accelerator system rather than a corporation that had a product and was doing that. So it survived for its ability to do biodiversity and adaptation. And so the rest of everything disappeared on that Fortune 100. So for all the CEOs that might be gnashing their teeth, as they feel the change happening, they have to know, with the history of business, that change is radical in these times of severe instability. And the end of the 1800s was a big change of this, where you're going from the robber baron kind of stuff with the railroad industry and all that being the drivers to suddenly manufacturing and technologies starting to take over, and the war machine became the biggest business of the first half of the 20th century. So companies that were building tanks and planes and innovating in that space became the real drivers of massive economics. And so the war machines became the biggest economies. Towards the end of the 20th century, we started to see the emergence of the tech industry as the driver in information technology. So it'd be like, your software companies suddenly became all the new billionaires, and that certainly accelerated in the early 2000s. But then, I'd say from 2005 to current, the last 15 years, the biggest companies in the world are now pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. In the United States, that's a $3.8 trillion a year direct expenditure on those companies' profits. And so we're pouring $3.8 trillion of taxpayer and hard-fought private dollars into the pockets of those pharmaceutical and healthcare companies that have become monopolies. And so we've seen these extraordinary shifts in what are the billionaire, multi-billionaire, Fortune 100 companies. Which ones are? They keep changing. And unfortunately, they are becoming more and more extractive to life, and that's how they get bigger and bigger. And so the healthcare industry is the biggest and most extractive form of energetic draw on life on the planet. And that's ironic for it to call itself a healthcare system, but that's where we stand today. The U.S. Healthcare system, chronic disease management, $3.8 trillion is 5 times larger than our entire defense and military budgets. And so 100 years ago, military machine was the biggest driver. And even up until the late 1990s and all of that, you have companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and all these kind of government contractors who are building all the multi-billion-dollar jets and aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, and they were driving the economy. And that they're not driving the economy today, and pharmaceutical companies are 5 times bigger than these government, military complexes ever dreamed themselves to be, is an extraordinary statement of extractive capacity. And unfortunately, it was bad for humans when we were killing each other through war, but it's horrific for the entire planet when our science of destruction of biodiversity at the microcellular level becomes our main business. And so we're doing it through chemotherapy, antibiotics, herbicides, pesticides, and the like. And so those companies, 5 times bigger than the military complex, the industrial medical complex, is built itself as a war machine against life itself. And so we're trying to kill cells, we're trying to kill bacteria, we're trying to kill weeds, we're trying to kill anything alive. And that's the biggest business we've ever created. So we've brought ourselves to the brink through that extractive march from let's build railroads and do global exchange to let's build war machines to let's build technologies of software that accelerate consumer behavior and the extraction of resources on the planet to let's extract life itself through the healthcare industry. I think we finally reached that pendulum swing of pinnacle. And so we have extracted everything we can possibly extract. We can't come up with a bigger fear narrative than we did with the pandemic. That was as big as it got on planet Earth. And so to get something bigger, we're going to have to pit planet Earth against the universe. And so we're going to have to say that aliens are attacking, or we've discovered some new virus coming from Mars. Like, we're going to have to come up with these extraordinary fear stories to keep us moving down the current extractive pathway and control the public anymore. So this is the moment we're in. What are the companies that are going to dominate the economy in 2050? They are not going to be the Fortune 100 companies today. I guarantee it. They are not going to be the Fortune 100 companies of today. And so what are those companies going to be? And I think left to the current trajectory, I fear the color of that Fortune 100. I fear just how horrific we could go on the destruction of civil liberties and the locking down of one world government and one military and just one police state worldwide, and everybody's controlled until we've just, we've created the Hunger Games kind of motif of a post-apocalyptic, governance structure and all that. That's the direction we're going. But ultimately, we are the thing that will create that future. All of us. We are the creative, generative forces of the future that could be here today. And for that, the Institute and many other organizations around the world are stepping up to reconnect us to indigenous wisdom. And natural law was, one of the original wisdoms coming out of our indigenous cultures. All of us are indigenous. It's not like we have to go meet somebody indigenous. We all are indigenous to planet Earth. This is our planet. This is our indigenous genomics. This is how we got here. Is we were indigenous to a planet. And so we have been birthed here. This is our home. And so we are all indigenous to a planet that's currently suffering from a schism of philosophy. And we have an opportunity to realign ourselves. And the excitement that I have at the biologic level in one patient with cancer is echoed at my excitement on one farm of 10,000 acres that decides to make the change. When the cancer patient decides to reintegrate themselves and stop fighting against the world they live in and start to really listen in deep to themselves and become themselves in a new way, find their own self-identity instead of be some amalgamation of abstract roles. I'm an employee, I'm a dad, I'm a boss, I'm a taxpayer, I'm a voter, I'm a Democrat, I'm a this and I'm a that. And we get so abstract in our sense of self that our body doesn't even know who we are, and we end up with all kinds of disease, autoimmune disease, fighting against a self we don't even know, cancer, destroying ourselves for not even being connected at the cellular level to know who we were at the beginning. And so whether we're looking at a cancer cell or a farm, we can see the immediacy of repair happen and the regenerative capacity after just one season of doing the right thing as an individual, getting in touch with your food system again, getting in touch with breath, water, sleep, stress disimpaction. You can become a completely new biology in 6 months. You will birth a new liver by then. Every cell in your liver will be brand new in 6 months. Every cell in your gut will be brand new in 3 days. And so you can build yourself a new body by changing your philosophy or relationship to your environment within yourself. And that farmer who for one season stops plowing, stops spraying to kill, and starts to ask it every single day, how do I increase the amount of biodiversity on this thing? I can do 15 species cover crops. I can get animals back onto my farm. I can plant more versions of crop production. I can start to imagine myself as in an energy farm, and I can start to participate in carbon sequestration and carbon cycles and global economies around carbon exchange. Suddenly that farmer's bottom line 5x's in 3 years. Like they get so much more profitable. They get so much, and the earth is doing things they never imagined because they haven't in 3 generations seen a farm that is free of chemicals. And the same thing happens at the human level. It often happens on a hospice situation. Somebody gets admitted to hospice, the very first thing we do as a physician on a hospice service is stop all their medications. And we stop their blood pressure medicine, we stop all their antidepressants and their management of their cholesterol, and we stop all these drugs. And suddenly their body reconnects to some original math and they suddenly get better. And so there's 10 or 15% of people admitted to hospice with a diagnosis of death within 3 months. And suddenly they're back to life. And they go on and they get discharged from hospice and they go on to live a new chapter. And so this is the moment that we're in right now, is if we choose to align ourselves philosophically at this global level, the earth will be new no matter what. With or without us, the earth will be new in 1,000 years. The earth will be new in 100 years, with or without us. And so whether we march into our own extinction or we shift, biology is going to do the thing it's always done. More biodiversity, more adaptation, resulting in more beauty and intelligence. The last extinction, we went from dinosaurs to mammals, birds in between. We went from palms and ferns to wildflowers, deciduous trees. All that got birthed out of the adversity of an extinction event. And so the next thing, can you imagine the jump from reptiles to mammals? And now we're at the next extinction. Imagine that same jump from mammals to what? How intelligent does life get on the planet in the next few million years? And can we make that the next couple thousand years if we become co-creators rather than consumers? And so that's going to be a big piece of the Institute of Natural Law and Governments, is realizing that as soon as you lose the scarcity mentality and you start to move into stewardship rather than ownership, and you start to become productive rather than consumptive, you become part of the solution. You become an accelerator to nature's patterns of biodiversification. The farmer who goes out and plants a 30-seed cover crop accelerated nature's plan dramatically. And so there's this cool way that we could become an accelerator to nature's own behavior if we listen in deep enough to know what those behaviors are. And for that, we may find that we are a brilliant manifestation of nature that she created to be a true partner with, to be a partner that's synergistic in our efforts and in our existence to every element of that nature.
That coming home, it's instead of it being about finding more technology or finding more whatever, it's actually about returning back, like trusting in natural law, trusting in natural order, trusting in diversity. That revolution, which is really its evolution, I suppose, is like from a personal level to begin to allow for diverse thought and diverse belief and to shift away from the clinging to the need for certainty and realizing that it's actually in diversity that we are liberated. And when we talk about that on an ideological level, that of course creates instability, but it actually creates connectivity, because now you have diverse thought, you have diverse connection, you have, you invite your person that you didn't invite to Thanksgiving last year, you invite them back. Like there's this, because of whoever they voted for, whether they chose to do a medical thing or whatever it is. But I think on a biological level, what does that mean in terms of how we interact with food, how we interact with, because I would imagine if we're eating these processed foods and high sugars, our microbiome on that very microscopic level is probably like, what's up, bro? Like, what are you doing over here? So where do you even start with that? And I also wanted to ask you about Ion, because I know this has been like a really super popular product. And I just want to know what is it doing on that level?
Yeah, the last, 10 years in our basic science laboratory of studying the microbiome communication, we've learned so much that is going to now be applied to natural law and governance and all these things. And it has to do with communication. And so Ion is first of its kind dietary supplement that is using the carbon molecules made by bacteria and fungi when they metabolize nutrients. From a human standpoint, it's tempting to call them waste products, right? So they turn a bunch of nutrients, micronutrients, macronutrients into fuel for potential use in our food system, and left over on the side is all these small carbon molecules of different shapes, sizes, lengths, and so we call them carbon snowflakes. Each snowflake looking different than the last. In the same way, all these carbon molecules look slightly different depending on which species is metabolizing which nutrients and the rest. And so they were seen as a waste product for a long time. One of my favorite things to do as an entrepreneur is to listen into conversations where people use the word waste. Because as soon as somebody uses the word waste, I know that there's an enormous opportunity there that probably has no competition. And so nature simply does not do waste. It does not do it anywhere in the system. Every single thing at every iteration of itself, as it moves through biologic systems, biophysics systems, through the atomic network, at every level of reality, everything has got great purpose and great value. And that's really what the lessons of natural law could be. Everything has great value. And therefore, how do we start to envision socioeconomic environments and beyond that value every element at every stage and recognize the role that each of those elements would have throughout the system? So what happened with Ion is we recognized that these waste streams were likely functioning as communication networks. And the way that was discovered was a bit of a coincidence, if you want to believe in coincidence. That my background had been in chemotherapy research, and I had been studying vitamin A compounds that were in a space called redox chemistry. Redox chemistry is the method of communication down at the molecular level. It's the way in which electricity information travels. You can picture it as a liquid circuit board, just like the circuit board in your computer transits information and makes I/O decisions and finds patterns and recognition of communication. And so this liquid circuit board that's made by the bacteria and fungi, we started to recognize based on my chemotherapy background. So we started studying the ability to extract these carbon molecules out of soil that was very ancient. And so we knew that the microbiome 60 million years ago was far more abundant in its diversity than it was currently because the last extinction wiped out the topsoil diversity, and we haven't quite recovered to that previous state 55 million years later. And so we were going after the richest, number of varieties of these carbon snowflakes we could find, and then we were allowing them to join this communication network again by getting hydrogen to bond back to these ancient carbon molecules. So there's no bacteria in it, there's no fungi in it, so it's not a probiotic. Instead, we were just going for a fluid communication stream from an ancient microbiome to see what would happen to human cells. And in 2012, when we first put these on human cells, we quickly discovered science that had never been witnessed before. And what we were witnessing was a rate of repair and regeneration that had never been imagined. Because up until that moment, we had always studied human disease in the context of an isolated human cell system within a petri dish. And it was really dramatic to start to witness what human cells would do in the context of a diverse microbiome communication network. And that's what we got to witness in 2012. And every year since then, it's been more and more mind-blowing as we've studied 7 different species, many different cell types within the body. Every single cell type that we put this stuff on begins this regenerative healing state that we just could not have pictured or imagined previous to these moments. The thing that I really love about this communication phenomenon that's happening at the cellular level with ION is that the very first thing that starts to repair are 2 macro structures within cell systems. And the first is tight junctions. Tight junctions are the Velcro that holds all our barriers together, the gut barrier to the outside world. It's the front line of defense of your immune system to the outside world. Those tight junctions are destroyed, incidentally, by glyphosate, which is Roundup, the main chemical in our food and water system. And so when you're talking about what happens when we eat processed food, certainly we do damage to the microbiome, but we also do damage to these tight junctions. And when you lose the tight junctions, you get a condition that's now popularly called leaky gut. What's happened at the molecular level is you have actually lost your self-identity at the cellular level. You no longer know what's outside and what's inside. And so your immune system starts to react to everything. And so you're reacting not only to all the food you eat and the air you breathe, and now you have environmental sensitivity, you have food sensitivities, you have environmental allergies, food allergies. You also are starting to develop inflammation in your joints. You're destroying your own joints. You're starting to get autoimmune disease, destroy your own thyroid, pancreas, brain, etc. And so we're seeing this complete cacophony of reactivity at the immune system level because you've forgotten who you are and you're just in a react to everything phase. And in a bizarre way, I think that we've seen the macro version of that in social media and beyond. We've lost our identity as a species and we're destroying ourselves. We have an autoimmune chronic inflammation of human behavior. And we are becoming more and more volatile, more and more reactive, more and more inflamed towards one another, just as the tissues within our bodies follow those pathways. And so to put this communication network back into play and see cell types of all variety start to repair tight junctions, it gives us this incredible promise that if we connect back into biodiversity, we will know our self-identity first. That will be the first healing that will happen. And so my hope with the Institute of Natural Law and Governance is the first thing that will happen when we start to consider ourselves as a society in the context of an environment of nature and an understanding of sociopolitical systems beyond human and start to see sociology within the context of all of nature, we will envision not only a better future, we will find ourselves for the first time. It is in our belief of our separation from nature that we've developed such a recalcitrant, extractive, fear-mongering, behavior. And so we can shift that just as we see ION doing to a cell membrane. The second thing that repairs itself in these cellular systems right after the tight junctions come together, so now you have a strong barrier, your immune system stress decreases, you start to find self again. The second thing that starts to form in concert is the gap junctions, which just lay just deep to the tight junctions. And the gap junctions are a series of fiber optic cables that move light energy between one cell to the next. And if you know anything about information technology, fiber optic cables are how you move the fastest and broadest bandwidth of information around the world. And so we used to do, copper wires. Now we're doing fiber optic cables because light can travel at the speed of light, and it can carry incredible bandwidth of information in very small cables. The nature proved fiber optics long before we ever developed it, and our cells communicate ultimately through light at their foundation. Interestingly, not only do we see the lysing of those gap junctions from the glyphosate molecules in our food, they're also lysed by alcohol. And we saw substance abuse go through the roof with alcohol sales during the pandemic. So we started to accelerate the loss of communication and our ability to transmit light at the cellular level. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories do it. So you start taking ibuprofen because you have low back pain because you have financial stress. Financial stress, especially within the home, always manifests low back pain. So now you start taking ibuprofen for your financial stress of the pandemic, and you start lysing all of the gap junctions, and your lights dim further, and you start to become depressed. And with depression comes worse pain, comes more anti-inflammatories, and it's a vicious cycle. Going beyond the anti-inflammatories, then we end up with cancer when we get a completely isolated cell where the gap junctions are totally gone. An isolated cell becomes cancer. And so the first thing we do is put somebody on chemotherapy, and chemotherapy has a way of lysing these tight gap junctions throughout the system worse. So they start reinforcing the original wound that would have led to the cancer in the beginning. And so we just have this slippery slope of loss of information happening in our medical system, in our food system, in our social behaviors, and the rest. And the first thing that we learn from ION is the first things to repair will be your self-identity and your ability to communicate and transmit light. And I get excited about that. Man, if the first things that happen when we reconnect to nature is we find our self-identity and we start to transmit more light as a species, that's a path I want to be a part of.
That's so cool. I think we could probably do a whole podcast on how boundaries are similar in terms of their cause of inflammation, correlation to leaky gut. Like it sounds to me like, again, as above, so below, right? Like what's going on the inside is going on the outside. To know that we both need to influence our environment as well as influence our internal world is, I think the level of responsibility, like you said about our government, we created it. Like we co-created all of these things. And so we can, as you said, direct our co-creation towards getting back into symbiosis with nature, circadian rhythms, being a productive part of what we're going to create rather than fighting natural law. Dr. Zach, it is always the greatest pleasure, and I'm always left with a lot of thoughts, hope, passion, all of it from our conversations. And for the people listening, where can they find more of you? Where can they find ION? Where can they find the Natural Law Institute?
Zach Bush, MD, ZachBushMD.com is my educational platform and an avenue into everything else I do too. So there's buttons for everything. If you're feeling like you're ready to reconnect your health to self and to a community, journeyofintrinsichealth.com is a great resource for you. It's an 8-week program that goes through the 8 steps of biology that reconnect you to that self-identity that we're talking about today. But I think more excitingly than even that, it actually connects you to a global community that's been through the journey. And we have an app that is a social app that allows all of you to stay in touch and to create user groups and micro and macro groups that are interested in changing the health and society around you at the community level. So journeyofintrinsichealth.com there. Intelligenceofnatures.com. Intelligenceofnature.com is where you're going to find the resources around soil and the redox chemistry and the connections of nature that you heard about today. And then Institute of Natural Law is going to be found at naturallawandgov.org. naturallawandgov.org. And so we're excited to keep you engaged and keep you part of these growing projects. If you're part of the regenerative community already, thank you. And if you haven't heard of Farmers Footprint, we encourage you to join us. We have Farmers Footprint in North America as our original form. FarmersFootprint.us is that website. We also have Farmers Footprint Australia going right now, and we're birthing in other countries actively as well. So excited to keep that regenerative movement going. So Farmers Footprint will find you your way to all of those regenerative stories and future farmers that are hopefully in your area. We have over 100 Meet the Farmer stories now that feature farms all over the North America and beyond that are starting to really feed their communities a regenerative food system and change the way in which the economics and business of food is being done. So join us somewhere in that mix and keep it going, Mark. We always appreciate what you're doing for your community to continue to encourage all of us to love each other more broadly, love each other more deeply, and always appreciate your messages that are coming across all your channels.
Much love, my friend. And for everyone listening, go check out. We'll link all that stuff in the show notes so you don't have to go to a browser and type it in. We know how no one likes to do that. Click on the show notes, click on it, go find whatever's calling to you, and Dr. Zach Bush. Thank you.
Appreciate you, Mark.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. If this episode resonated with you, one of the best ways to support the show is to go subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any more. Leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it, or share the episode with your community on Instagram or whatever social place you like to hang out. This helps get it into more people's ears, and I'm so grateful for your support, always. Thanks again for tuning in. Much love.